Starting us off in at number 10 with the 201-hour sleep deprivation experiment. Back in 1959, a radio DJ wanted to perform a publicity stunt for a charity event. He decided to stay awake for 200 hours, and he broadcasted the entire thing on his radio show. He was monitored by scientists who monitored his vitals because he needed to take a lot of stimulants to stay awake. He sat in a booth in Times Square where people could pledge money, but his innocent experiment quickly turned dangerous. After being awake for several hours, he wasn't able to do simple math problems, recite the alphabet, and he began to hallucinate.
Mean body temperature progressively declined over this period of time, and the lower it went, the crazier he got.
He thought the scientists were conspiring to kill him, so he literally drove himself mad. He stayed awake for 201 hours, but he was drugged for the majority of the event.
After staying awake for 201 hours, Tripp finally went to bed and slept for 24.
Some people say that his experiment affected him permanently, and soon afterwards he lost his job and his wife divorced him. A controversial reality TV show is at number 9. Okay, don't worry, I'm not talking about Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I haven't been keeping up with them. In 2004, a British reality TV show called Shattered was aired for millions of people to watch. Basically, there's 10 contestants that signed up to be locked up in an abandoned shopping center for 7 days, but they had to stay awake and compete in challenges throughout the show. Sounds like my worst nightmare, or it kind of reminds me of the movie Dawn of the Dead, but without zombies. Claire Southern eventually won this horrible contest, and she actually managed to stay awake for 178 hours. She was awarded with £97,000, which in Canada, that's a lot of money. That might be worth it for me. But she was mentally and physically tortured. I don't know if I can deal with that part of it. A show like Shattered would not stand a chance being aired today. A lot of people complain about the show because it is highly unethical and demoralizing. With that being said, let's watch a clip.
It's very difficult. This is the most difficult thing I've ever done in my entire life.
The time of greatest struggle for our participants is between 1 and 3 a.m, when your mind automatically attempts to prepare your body for sleep. It's the perfect time for the nightly You Snooze, You Lose challenge, when one person must face a task deliberately designed to push them towards the land of Nod. So far, only one person has cracked.
Number 8 brings us to exploding head syndrome. Yeah, this is actually a real thing, but it's not actually what you think. Exploding head syndrome is a type of parasomnia. People with this condition have a hallucination of a really loud noise while they're falling asleep or when they're waking up. Even though exploding head syndrome isn't dangerous, it can be extremely frustrating. It would terrify me, and people who are affected by this, they might develop a fear of sleeping or an anxiety disorder. Up next, number 7 is sleep-deprived puppies. This next sleep experiment will leave you guys with nightmares. A Russian physician and scientists performed a sleep deprivation experiment on a bunch of puppies back in 1894 to study the effects of sleep deprivation on the body. The scientists reported that after a few days, the puppies who were forced to stay awake died. She also reported that severe lesions occurred in the brain. Okay, wow, this scientist is worse than Cruella de Vil. If that wasn't enough, 2 other scientists wanted to perform a very similar experiment. They kept dogs awake by walking them, and they quickly realized that all of the dogs who were sleep deprived died after 9 to 17 days. The Russian sleep experiment takes us to number 6. We've talked about this sleep experiment many times on this channel. Well, this is a highly debated and controversial subject because some people believe that the Russian sleep experiment was just a hoax, while others believe that this is a huge government conspiracy. What do you guys think? But essentially, this was a sleep deprivation experiment that took place during World War II. Russian scientists performed a series of unethical, unmoral, and horrifying experiments on 5 political prisoners that can be compared to a modern day horror story. The prisoners were locked in a gas chamber where a form of experimental gas was pushed through the vents in order to prevent them from sleeping. It was the goal of this experiment to observe all of their behaviors and conversations through one-way mirrors to see how sleep deprivation would affect humans. The intent was to keep them awake for a period of 30 days, which is absolutely insane. Lack of sleep affects your immune system, and you know what? This takes us to number 5. Ain't that feeling when you're about to to get sick, you just know your week is going to be awful. For me, I know I'm getting sick when my allergies are just crazy. So it really surprises me that 164 healthy people signed up for a sleep study where they would be exposed to the common cold. Okay, let me explain. Scientists collected nightly sleep data from these 164 people for 1 week. They were quarantined in a hotel and given nose drops that contained the rhinovirus, which is responsible for the common cold. And then they studied how people would cope with the cold based on their sleep patterns. They discovered that people who slept for less than 5 hours a night were 4.5 times more likely to get sick than those who slept for 7 hours or more. So the moral of the story here is make sure you guys go to bed early tonight and get those 7 hours in. If you're late for school, tell your teachers you're working on your mental health. You are getting some sleep. I don't know if they can, yeah, you probably don't do that. You get in trouble. The world record for sleep deprivation takes us to number 4. Let's travel back in time to December 1963 when 2 boys came up with an idea for their science project, and their science project landed on this list. Well, they wanted to beat out the world record for staying awake for the longest. At the time, the record was held by a DJ who managed to stay up for 260 hours, or just under 11 days. I don't know who their science teacher was, but I'm pretty sure he shouldn't have approved this experiment. How stupid. I mean, it sounds dangerous to me, but they carried on with their experiment anyways, and the one boy managed to stay awake for 264 hours with no sleep. After the experiment ended, he was taken to a naval hospital where his brainwaves were studied, and they found out that even though he was technically awake, parts of his brain were napping and restoring itself. The Guinness Book of World Records stopped certifying attempts to stay up the longest because they believe it can be dangerous to people's health, which I find pretty ironic because they still let people eat glass and lay on bed of nails, and there's a lot of dangerous stuff in that book. So if you get rid of some dangerous, you should get rid of all dangerous. But maybe that's just me. Moving up this list or down this list, depending on how you see it. Next up, we're at number 3 with prison sleep deprivation. As a way to attempt to brainwash prisoners, guards would force prisoners to stay awake for long periods of time. The North Koreans used this tactic on American prisoners of war during the Korean War, and the CIA is even guilty of doing this too. Psychologists have said that false memories can occur with sleep deprivation, so that's why interrogators will keep their suspects awake so that they can hopefully create a false memory and confess to a crime. Or prisoners will just keep their prisoners awake as a form of modern day torture. Probably one of the worst ways to be tortured. Sleep paralysis comes onto this list at number 2. Sleep paralysis is when your mind is awake but your body is still asleep. So basically you feel like you're paralyzed while laying in bed, and sometimes you will see or hear things that aren't there. I don't know if this has ever happened to you guys. It's actually happened to me a few times. According to one user on Reddit, one night they woke up because they heard footsteps in their hallway. She was lying on her back, and when she tried to get up to see if someone was coming, she actually couldn't move. She started to panic, but she couldn't move or speak, but the footsteps got louder and louder. She said that she couldn't see anyone, but she knew that someone was invading her house. She can even feel him standing on the other side of the bed staring at her, and she said that she can hear him breathing, and apparently this feeling lasted for hours. Government mind control tactics tops our list in at number 1. Project MK Ultra is a code name that was given to a number of illegal experiments that were done on human subjects. These experiments were done so that scientists can identify and develop drug procedures that could be used in interrogations in order to weaken the person or force confessions through mind control. MK Ultra used a ton of different methods to alter the brain. They would often give people LSD and other chemicals, use hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, verbal and physical abuse, and other forms of torture. The scary thing is that these experiments took place in the 1950s, so it wasn't really that long ago when you think about it. I mean, my dad was born about 4 years after that.
Kicking off our list at number 10, mini brains. Yeah, mini brains with little tiny mini eyes. That's where we'll start today. Yeah, welcome back, I guess. August 2021, a strange but daring group of scientists announced that they had grown a little human brain, equipped with its own set of eyes. Yeah, it's actually not called a mini brain, of course, that's a bit much. Its scientific term is organoid or organoid. I'm not really sure. Organoid sounds like something you'd order at a restaurant. An organoid sounds like an instrument. The entire goal here was for scientists to understand eye disease furthermore, right? These organoids, these organoids come from stem cells, and ideally growing organoids allows researchers to study how organs develop and provide new information into how organs could react early to specific treatments. So they're like little mini tiny what ifs and little signs, little tiny balls of what ifs, essentially, that have eyes. They're really kind of gross to look at. Little brains with eyes equals science. The more you know. Number 9, daddy short legs. I'm not a fan of the bug or its name, so here we go. Calling a bug daddy or like daddy long legs, that's so weird to me. I've never liked that. Even as a kid, I'm like, that's not right. Now we might have to add daddy short legs to the mix. That's a real thing. A lot of dads in the bush. Let's talk about them. Scientists have recently created a version where daddy long legs' legs are stunted at birth. Therefore, they're daddy shorter legs. By doing this, they were able to study what they looked like millions of years ago. The daddy long legs, right now, it has a unique way of hunting and moving around. But once the legs were shorter, it almost went back to a form of travel that could only be seen 400 million years ago. It started to move differently, which is kind of cool. How far back do we need to go to get rid of the word daddy? That's my next question. Is that 500 million years? Maybe 600? It's a bug named daddy. Why do we do this? Number 8, undead as a dog. Any dog lovers out there? Awesome. Hit that thumbs up and also maybe skip to the next one. I don't know. A team of Russian scientists released a video in which they showed a few dog heads that were being kept alive by an artificial blood circulation system. No, we're not going to show the video. Sickos. But we can certainly talk about the video. I can do that for you. In the video, the scientists use a heart-lung machine and they're able to show the dog's head responding to sound. Now, scientifically, that's wild. That's a feat, no doubt. Awesome. You guys nailed it. But walking into this room by accident, that's gotta be pretty jarring, pun intended. They would wiggle their ears, they would blink their eyes, and sometimes they were even able to lick their mouths. So that's a terrifying thing to imagine, all just one head. In 2005, for some reason, American scientists began to try and recreate this horrifying experiment. So they flushed out all the blood from a dog and replaced it with oxygen and sugar saline, all that horrible stuff. And then 3 hours after this, and then after a blood transfusion and of course an electrical shock, the dog somehow was brought back to life. Yeah, I wish I knew the purpose or like the end game of this experiment, but couldn't tell you. I mostly wish I just never knew it, to be honest with you, and that we never included it, but it's too late. Number 7, robot dog. This one's a lot better, I promise. Nothing like the last one. Imagine meeting a cyborg version of you. Imagine being a dog and you had to meet another cyborg dog. That's gotta be pretty horrifying. Well, that was the pitch back in 2003 when researchers from the University in Budapest and the Sony Computer Science Laboratory in Paris got together. Yeah, a dream team, some would say. The world was never the same. They're like, should we make Spider-Man movies? They're like, yeah, this first right now. And put this robot dog near the real dog's food. So when the real dog ate, it was growling, it was watching this other thing, and then ultimately it took a chomp and threw it across the room. This robot dog. It could be the fact that something was near its food source in general, but still probably uneasy that a robot dog is staring at it like, you know, let's try to eat. Imagine that in the morning, just looking at you. It's like, hey, am I bugging you? You're like, kind of, yes. You can buy Abo, the cyborg dog, for an easy $3,000 right now. Or you could adopt, you know, that's always great and preferred too. Number 6, Stubbins Firth. Okay, this is one of the craziest science projects I've ever heard of. We're getting a little real now. Here we go. A researcher from Pennsylvania back in the late 1700s, well, first of all, as you can probably guess, methods back then were gross. They were really messy. They didn't know what they were doing. A lot of firsts in the medical science world, including Firth. Firth was a doctor in training at the time, and he decided to prove to the world that yellow fever was not contagious. Yeah, imagine if he had Twitter right now. You know what I mean? Firth would surgically insert vomit, you know, like vomit, from patients with yellow fever. He would insert that liquid of vomit into his body. He would put this stuff in his wounds, all over his face, his eyes, his pores. He was trying to get it in everything. He was purposely going the extra mile, all in the name of medical research. I'm gonna throw up now. This is so gross. Even urine or saliva, anything that was, you know, in your body, just pour it on, that's it. Just like in Uh-Oh, that TV show where the guy dumps the bucket of goop on the person who gets the trivia question wrong. Just like a bucket of that stuff, just poured right on. And to everybody's surprise, he did not get sick afterwards at all. He was pretty proud of that one. He told everybody this scientific breakthrough. We look back now though, and we realize that Firth just sampled late stage patients. So they were further along, much further than the contagious period. So basically he did all this for nothing. He volunteered to dump all over his, yeah. History's gross. Science as well, very gross. Just a lot of gross Firths in the community. Number 5, the monster study. Speech pathologists, miracle workers most of the time, except for 1939. Back in 1939, speech pathologists at the University of Iowa, they were determined to crack the secret behind stuttering. You know, if you find out the key source, then you can kind of trace back to the problem, yada yada. Sure, I get it. But they believed that it all began with young adults and their fear of public speaking. So these researchers decided to intimidate people and try and induce stuttering. Yeah, they got patients who were showing signs of stuttering early and they verbally attacked them. They kept telling them they shouldn't speak unless they're sure they can do so properly. They were yelling at them, making it very intense on purpose. The experiment did not induce stuttering at all, rather it induced extreme anxiety. Yeah, obviously. Hence why it was referred to as the monster study. 3 of these patients later sued Iowa and the university for $925,000. Yeah, you can't be scaring people. Number 4, Francis Crick. As we go on further, we kind of have to have a laugh. You know, the last few have been pretty f***ed up. Back in the early 1900s, Francis Crick, aka the guy who discovered DNA alongside James Watson, 2 brilliant minds, dare I say these life-changing discoveries, well, it was also announced back then that they also believed in directed transpermia, meaning that humans were put on this planet by aliens. Yeah, like extraterrestrial, like aliens. That's what they fully believed in. The DNA guys believe that we're aliens. So you're like, okay, what's right, what's wrong? What do we do here? Some of his methods involved conversations to patients, real patients. He was a doctor. He'd be like, hey, let's talk about DNA. Also, did you know that aliens planted us here? Cool, I'm Francis Crick. No, that's alarming. Don't do that. Number 3, worm diet. Apologies if you're eating right now. I know myself, I like to snack out and watch YouTube videos late at night. This one, maybe not. Maybe skip this one. Hit the thumbs up and skip it. It's really gross. Back in 1878, Giovanni Battista Grassi covered himself with worms, all in the name of science. His trick, well, his method rather, was to ingest worm eggs, which he kept after autopsies. That's horrible. That's the worst thing I've ever heard in my entire life. Weird hobby, even weirder project. Some parasitologists would argue that this project changed the game and, you know, improved their medical knowledge, yada yada, but I still think it's the grossest thing that I've ever heard on this planet, and who would do such a thing? I had to mention it. Science rules, I guess, right? Science rules. Number 2, inner armor. We've all wanted to be a superhero at some point, you know? When you're watching the movie halfway through, you're like, you know what? I really do want that. I want that technology just blasted on my chest, sure. Well, DARPA's Inner Armor project was the Pentagon's way of creating super soldiers. Scientists use animals as reference for these new abilities, like literally from a Marvel movie. Right now, they're studying the DNA of the stellar sea lion because it can reduce blood flow away from organs if need be, in order to reduce oxygen demand. So that would be pretty sweet. You can just stay underwater forever, ideally. That's a cool superpower to have, I guess. Dr. Michael Callahan, who is in charge of running this whole operation, he says the goal is to make soldiers kill-proof against disease, chemical weapons, radioactive weapons, harsh weather conditions, everything, you name it. Now, this was back in 2007, and of course, in 2014, Barack Obama announced that the United States is building Iron Man armor. Put these two together, we have Superman, I guess. That's exciting on one hand, but do we think this is a good idea? Like, where is this gonna go? What if somebody decides to be an awful human being wearing all of these, you know, vests of armor? Am I crazy? Comment down below if you think an Iron Man suit of armor would be a good or a terrible idea. I vote terrible. And finally, number 1, go pills. Look out, 5-hour energy. It's game over. Pack your shit. You're fired. These guys have you beat. Every time I watch Lord of the Rings, I fall asleep. Look, I can't help it. It's a great film, sure, but it's just so cozy. The music, it tucks me right in. I don't know. But that's not an issue in the real world, is it? No, not at all. Overnight truck drivers staying awake all night, military personnel that needs to be awake all night for operations or for days at a time, that's a bit more important. Definitely. And that's where Go pills were supposed to come in handy. The pill that keeps you up for 40 hours straight. 40 hours, that's insane. The US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA for short, is currently funding this pill. Would you want this? Would you ever touch this? I wouldn't do this personally. The benefits it would have, they sound great, but again, right now they're not sure if the long-term side effects are worth it. You don't want people hallucinating mid-flight. You know what I mean? That's bad news. But I'd get through a game of Mario Party 50 turns, so.
We have Japan's Unit 731. Today we look at Japan as the land of anime and Hello Kitty. They seem like such a nice, polite group of people that never want to do any harm to anyone. But remember, before they were the land of samurai and warfare, and during World War II they were aligned with the Nazis. The PR campaign that went on over there was amazing. And during World War II there was one of the most horrific units ever, which was known as Unit 731. They performed some of the most brutal experiments on people known to man. They were mostly performed on Chinese people, as they would invade Chinese villages while they destroyed and murdered everyone. They would take fleas that were infected with horrible diseases and they would let them loose on people. They would go in and infect people with cholera and other horrible diseases to see how they would spread. They wanted to test how much pressure the human body could take, so they would take Chinese prisoners and they would put them into a pressurized tank and they would keep increasing the pressure until their eyes exploded in their head. And that is just some of the horrible things that happened. Coming in at number 9, we have Bringing Back the Dead. Now this next experiment wasn't performed on humans, but at the end they said it would work on humans, which is absolutely insane. There was a study done in California that wanted to see if you could take a dead organ and implant it into a person and have that person live. This should be impossible because once an organ is dead, the cells will no longer function. Well, turns out that's not true. They were able to successfully transfer a dead heart into a baboon, and the baboon could use it to survive. However, it did later die, but this was the early stages of the testing, and as I said before, they were confident that they could eventually use this on humans. I guess you could get a big discount on a heart if it's been dead for a little while. Coming in at number 8, we have the monster study. I see why people don't trust people. When you let someone in, like someone you're supposed to trust, like a doctor or a scientist, and then they use this as an opportunity to ruin your life. In 1939, a professor at the University of Iowa had a theory that there was a link between confidence and stuttering, that kids with anxiety stutter because they are too afraid to talk. So to prove his theory, he went to an orphanage and indoctrinated kids with the idea that they would stutter in the future. He was trying to make them stutter. So guess what happened? They never started stuttering, but they became too afraid to talk. Coming in at number 7, we have electroshock therapy on kids. I am very happy I grew up in a home where my parents treated my behavioral problems with yelling and not experimental treatments. This all comes from Dr. Loretta Bender, who was a psychotherapist in the 60s and thought that she could cure future mental disorders through electrocuting the brain. And it didn't really seem like there was anyone too young to be diagnosed as a possible victim of psychosis, as the youngest person she ever experimented on was 3 years old. Eventually her whole project was shut down. Coming in at number 6, we have MK Ultra. This is one of the most famous experiments for several reasons. One, the CIA was involved. They funded, documented, and participated in almost everything associated with the test. There were some people who think that Charles Manson was one of the test subjects, and on top of all of this, conspiracy theory people love this one. For those of you who don't know, MK Ultra was when the American government went deep into trying to find a way to perform mind control on people. They did this through many means. Sometimes they would put people in isolation for extended periods of time. They would also see how hypnosis affects the brain, and the most popular part about this is they would use LSD to see how much it would affect people and if their minds could be controlled with the drug. One thing they would do is have prostitutes that were actually CIA agents dose Johns and then watch what would happen to them. That's a night you won't soon forget. And bringing it back to the Charles Manson conspiracy, some people think that they used LSD on him while he was in prison because they would also take prisoners for these experiments and not tell them what was happening. And through this, some people think Charles Manson learned how to influence people through LSD and later used this to build his cult. Coming in at number 5, we have Project Artichoke. Turns out the CIA tried to master mind control more than once. While MK Ultra was more of a test to control the mind surrounding LSD and seeing if they could control a person to divulge secret information, Project Artichoke was seeing if they could control a person's mind and make them do their bidding. Basically, if you can make them a robot and send them out into the world to do whatever you wanted. None of these test subjects knew they were being experimented on, and some of the attempts at controlling a person came through getting them addicted to morphine and seeing how far they would go to get a fix. Coming in at number 4, we have the Stanford Prison Experiment. This study was done to see if human beings naturally gravitate towards being evil if given the opportunity. It was run by Philip Zimbardo, and it took place in a fake prison where students volunteered to be both prisoners and prison guards. This would mimic a real prison scenario. At first glance, it would seem that humans have a tendency to treat each other horribly and will abuse power, as the prison guards started treating the prisoners horribly even though they knew they were fellow students. They would go out of their way to humiliate them, and many prisoners started to show signs of mental breakdown. The experiment was cut short because the violence increased to such a level that the safety of the students was at risk. So are people naturally monsters? Well, it wouldn't seem so. It was later revealed that Zimbardo told the students playing the guards that they should treat the prisoners poorly and encourage their malicious behavior. So the study wasn't conducted on fair grounds and is now viewed as something extremely unethical. Coming in at number 3, we have the Stateville Penitentiary Malaria Test. Here's something I'm learning from this list. If you're in prison and they ever offer you to do some testing, say no, because who knows what's going to happen to you, and it seems that the people testing you see you as expendable. I think I'll just serve out my sentence without being exposed to some sort of horrible disease or experimental drug. Well, the Stateville Malaria Test was put in place to help out the war effort in World War II. There was a huge problem with malaria, so the Americans wanted to come up with a vaccine. They did this by offering prisoners the opportunity to be part of some testing. Mind you, the people involved were willful applicants, but I don't think they knew the severity of what they were getting themselves into. Coming in at number 2, we have the Tuskegee study. When you hear about stuff like this, it makes perfect sense why people don't trust the government or government officials. In the year 1932, the Tuskegee study was started and saw almost 400 black men in Alabama infected with syphilis without them knowing. The purpose of the study was to see the long-term effects of syphilis, which range from syphilis infecting your eyes and causing you to go blind. It can go into your spine and cause your spinal column to decay, and it can also go into your brain and cause you to go insane, as well as a ton of other horrible effects. This was a government-funded experiment, and all of the subjects were black men. They were told that they were being treated for bad blood. One of the most horrible aspects of this study was that it went on for 40 years, well after the cure for syphilis was discovered. Coming in at the number 1 spot, we have the twin studies. One of the most horrific parts of the Second World War were the experiments performed by Joseph Mengele in the concentration camps. Mengele is one of the most infamous people of the war, and for good reason. He was a heartless monster who did horrible things to people that can never be forgiven. For some reason, his main focus was on twins. He had twins brought to him from all over Europe, and in total he would perform experiments on about 1,500 sets of twins. He would do things like sew them together. He would remove limbs from one twin to see if the other twin could feel the missing limb, and on more than one occasion he would inject chloroform into the hearts of the twins to see if they would live.
Kicking off the list at number 10, the aviator suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible fast history. Number 9. The Hoffling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called Astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The Astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 8, UCLA schizophrenia experiment. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Neutraline went to great and pretty unethical lengths just to see how people who are suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Yeah, basically they're trying to figure out if there is a way to predict the relapse, or a psychosis episode of some sorts. Now, sounds like a good idea on paper, I guess, but the way you go about things, historically, come on, we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia at the time, and then just taking them off their meds completely. Yeah, as I said that, you at home probably went, ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. What a horrible idea. Like, we're going the opposite way here. We're not supposed to do this, right? There's no suitable plan and order for when they could return to their medication. And they also didn't do a good job making sure these patients were actually safe during these experiments. They're like, yeah, let's just take people off their meds, see what happens. It's horrible. It's one of the worst. Unfortunately, the results were as bad as you thought and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. Again, not sure what we expected here in this sense. An article from 1994 also said the doctors failed to get proper consent from the patients as well. Just a cherry on top of this horrible experiment. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. There you go. Number 7, psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, go pills. Here in Toronto, we have go trains, go buses, but not go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy. We got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging, even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie. You'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where go pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight, so a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test, for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. the teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. Number 3, MK Ultra. We have to include a mind control project. Do you believe in mind control? Some claim they're born with it, like an X-Men, so if that's you, you know where to meet. MK Ultra, where do I start? Okay, it was originally a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them hallucinogens in an attempt to crack mind control, or sorry, as they called it, information gathering. Yeah, it's like what Apple says. Oh, we're just gathering information. Yeah, okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and or North Korean agents were all using mind control in the war. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. Yeah, it's gotta be brainwashing, nothing else, right? Horrible tests were being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, in prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was a huge, horrible secret. The agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it officially ended, so we think we know, when in reality we probably know little to nothing what actually occurred. Number 2, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's talk about it. It started August 14th, 1971. It was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Again, another university study. My gosh. I mean, to be fair, Hogwarts was also messed up, but Hogwarts wasn't real now, was it? The Stanford Prison Experiment was very real. The experiment took volunteers and divided them into 2 groups. One group of prisoners and one group of guards. And they placed all these volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment, okay? The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil, under the right conditions of course, with the right amount of power. Yeah, pretty twisted, right? It's basically a group version of the Milgram experiment. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, we found out. Yeah, 6 days later, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners in the worst ways possible. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after just a short amount of time, less than a week. And humans are like, oh, I'll be evil. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment. What a dark one.
Starting us off at at number 10, dog experiments. A few years back, PETA released a scathing expose on the Texas A&M University's laboratories. What was branded as a breeding program turns out to have been closer to a cruel experiment under the guise of science. It turns out that they had been actively lying about their dog breeding program and were actually using the dogs for cruel and painful experiments. Dogs under their care were deliberately bred to develop a crippling form of canine muscular dystrophy that prevented most of the dogs from walking, eating properly, or having any kind of quality of life. From there, they would use the dogs in experiments involving biopsies and these devices that stretched their muscle tissue, causing them not only incredible pain during the procedures, but ultimately forcing many of the dogs to be euthanized due to the toll it put on their bodies. Apparently, the university had been doing these kinds of experiments for nearly 40 years before PETA was able to put an end to it, and thankfully all of the dogs have now been rescued and are being sent to new homes. Next up at number 9, hepatitis. In the 1950s, one institution ran a very dark experiment that I honestly can't quite believe was able to happen even that long ago. The institution was for disabled people, specifically those deemed to have mental illnesses or mental disorders at that time. And due to the highly unsanitary conditions of this institution, many contracted hepatitis. You would think that this would maybe make them go, oh, maybe we should tidy up around here, protect those that are under our care, but that was not really their approach. Instead, Dr. Saul Krugman proposed an experiment to try and develop a vaccine. Now, while I can appreciate the thought that was behind his proposition, rather than testing on the already contracted citizens, they actually began purposefully infecting people with the disease to assist in the experiment. Now, don't get it twisted, there were many folks against this from the start, but ultimately parents of the admitted people gave their permission to infect them and use them in the study, so forth they went. It's kind of crazy to believe that someone would actually go along with that, but apparently they didn't seem to care too much about infecting disabled people with a deadly disease, so there you have it. Coming in at number 8, Project Artichoke. In the 1950s, the CIA ran a series of mind control projects called Project Artichoke, and their goal was simple, but definitely unethical. The primary goal was to see if a person could involuntarily be made to attempt an act of assassination. So essentially they were trying to see if they could mind control someone into killing another person. At first they went about trying to gain mind control by studying the test subjects via hypnosis and total isolation as a means to break down the subjects. But soon they realized something was missing. In came forced morphine addictions along with a slew of other drugs, followed by forced withdrawal. They would also use chemicals to incite amnesia on the human subjects, and those that got out were left incredibly foggy and traumatized with little to no recollection of what they had been through. The study was shut down by the 1960s, likely due to the fact that they were traumatizing and forcing addiction on unsuspecting innocent civilians, but it did open the door for more research around the possibility of mind control, so you never know, maybe someday it might just be possible. Next up at number 7, the two-headed dog. In 1959, Vladimir Demikov had a truly evil vision. His experiments were among some of the first organ and tissue transplant research, which ultimately some have argued is obviously very valuable information, but his methods were certainly unethical and definitely controversial. He started out transplanting organs by sewing them onto the outside of animals, but ultimately gained his notoriety for creating a two-headed dog. To make his Frankenstein dog, he removed the head and front legs of a small dog from the rest of its body and then transplanted it onto a larger host dog. The dogs actually lived for 4 days after the experiment, declaring it seemingly successful, and they were able to see and look around during that time. So all in all, while it did help chart the course of modern transplants, it was certainly viewed as a very controversial study. Next up at number 6, the Milgram experiment. Named after the psychologist Stanley Milgram, who spearheaded the experiment, this study began in the summer of 1961, and it looked at testing the limits of obedience. Many academics at the time wanted to take a look into what was at the core of an authoritative personality, and how someone could be swayed to commit something that ultimately they didn't want to do simply because they believed they had to. A newspaper advertisement was sent out, but the details were not provided until test subjects arrived. Once the study began, the two groups were separated. One group was assigned to be an actor and the other group was tasked with shocking the person in the room after they answered a question wrong. What group 2 didn't know was that group 1 was not actually being shocked, just acting as if they were. And as it turns out, an incredibly high proportion of the subjects continued to shock the group despite thinking they were hurting them, simply because they felt they had no other choice. And later, another scientist thought the experiment needed to be amped up, as he hypothesized people could have felt the victim was faking it. The new study included real-life dogs as the subjects, being shocked, and test subjects apparently openly wept while still following orders to shock the dogs, apparently proving that many humans will follow orders to a fault. Coming in at number 5, radiation. After World War II, there were many questions surrounding radioactive materials and the effects these could have on humans moving forward. Well, apparently they decided the best people to test out this incredibly harmful and dangerous study on would of course be pregnant women. Medical researchers fed radioactive edibles in the form of energy drinks to 829 pregnant women, and not only didn't they tell them what they were giving them, but they straight up lied and said that it would actually improve the health of their babies. Many of the women in the study became incredibly ill, would get covered in rashes and bruises, and some ultimately ended up developing cancer. But worst of all is that many of the fetuses were in fact born with leukemia or other forms of cancer, and the mothers didn't even know that they had been involved in an experiment in the first place. That was until it was much too late. Coming in at number 4, the syphilis study. Back in 1932, the United States Public Health Service began to dive into the natural progression of syphilis if left untreated. And listen, I understand that these kinds of experiments provide us with knowledge of how to help protect people in the future, but what I'm saying is that there are better ways to go about it. In this study, 600 poor and illiterate men, of which only 399 previously had syphilis, were hired, and none of them were told about what the experiment was going to be for, or that they had a life-threatening disease in the first place. The 600 men were instead told that they were actually receiving free healthcare, meals, and burial insurance in exchange for their participation. What's even more sick is that even though penicillin was proven to be an effective cure in 1947, the study continued all the way until 1972, essentially needlessly infecting hundreds of people and watching them die of a disease that already had a cure. I mean, it's just insane that this went on for so long, and it's definitely one of the most evil experiments to have seen the light of day. Coming in at number 3, eugenics. Prior to World War II, there was actually many places around the United States that were pro-eugenics. Of course, this all changed after the infamous evil experiments performed in the war, but rewind to 1907 and it was actually widely accepted across the nation. Firstly, sterilization was enacted as a hypothesis to help reduce crime rates and stop mental disabilities. And then not long after, they began to bring race in as a factor in the hopes to improve genetic stock through the sterilization of unpreferred races. Because it is women who give birth, they were often the victims of these experiments, as eugenicists believed it was the best way to protect and regulate birth rates and weed out who they didn't want to be able to reproduce. Although it was first overturned in 1921, by 1927 the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of forced sterilization, believing it would create a better society for us all to live in. I mean, it's truly horrid that this was not only legal, but encouraged by so many. Coming in at number 2, a cure for insanity. 1907 seems to have been a busy year for evil scientists, but rather than eugenics, this doctor believed he could actually cure insanity. Dr. Henry Cotton was convinced that internal organs, upon developing an infection, were the root cause of mental disorders. So Cotton got got involved with the asylum and got to researching on what he refers to as patients, but really were victims of his cruel experiments. He believed that by removing the infected organ, he could not only cure his patients of their disorders, but then study that organ for further research. And that's all well and fine if you're dealing with maybe a root canal, but when it comes to vital organs, it's not the same story. Dubbed surgical bacteriology, the procedures were often done without the patient's consent, and he would remove teeth, tonsils, and even colons and other organs of the leg. To further prove his point, he even removed his own teeth along with his wife and sons too, which, I mean, if he was trying to prove a point, does that mean he thought he was insane? Because why else would he remove his teeth? But in the end, 49 of his patients died, which he chalked up to end-stage psychosis, and to this day the project is viewed as incredibly cruel. Last up in our #1 spot, the Aversion Project. Led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, this program identified homosexual soldiers from the army and subjected them to horrific medical tortures as a means to try and change their sexual orientation. Now, at the time, it was believed that being gay was a disease that could be and should be cured, and so the experiment to convert soldiers began. The experiment lasted between 1971 to 1989, and the soldiers were submitted to extensive electric shock treatment while being forced to view explicit images of the same sex, trying to cause their brain to make negative associations with homosexuality. When the subjects didn't change, or at least didn't admit to changing their sexual orientation, they would force the victims into sex-changing operations, making them effectively straight women in their eyes. Reportedly, 900 gay men between 16 to 24 were surgically changed into women against their will, and once the experiment was shut down, Levin fled to Canada and denied ever being a part of the cruel and evil experiment.
Starting off this countdown, we have the oil-eating superbugs. Wouldn't it be great if there was a bug out there that could go around eating oil? That way, they could easily clean up oil spills and help clean our planet. Well, that's exactly the idea that General Electric scientists had in the mid-1970s. They introduced a plasmid that allowed a bacteria to digest petroleum. But thankfully, people realized how dangerous this would be. This engineered bacteria could start consuming everything in its path and then outcompete other bacteria and organisms, and then destroy the balance on Earth. So I'm glad that they didn't follow through with this one. In our 9th spot, we have Project Artichoke. This is one of the many unethical experiments conducted by the CIA. This one took place in the 1950s as the CIA wanted to see if they could take complete control of a person so that they could do their biddings for them against their own will. Project Artichoke used hypnosis, forced morphine addiction, withdrawal, and the use of chemicals to try and cause amnesia in the test subjects. Thankfully, this project was shut down in the mid-1960s. Imagine if they did find a way to gain complete control over humans. Imagine what sick stuff they could make us do. They could turn us into cold-blooded killing machines. In our 8th spot, we have the radiation tests. Back in 1954, the US conducted a number of radiation tests on humans. They called this Project 4.1. It all started with Project Castle Bravo. This was a series of high-yield thermonuclear weapon tests that took place on Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Little did they know that the yield of radiation was going to be much larger than they anticipated. This left a number of residents injured, so they created a secret study to, and I quote, evaluate the severity of radiation injury to those accidentally exposed. Now, some say that the exposure to the radiation was accidental, that they didn't really mean for it to happen. Others believe that this was part of their plan all along. And obviously, nuclear testings are bad for a number of reasons. The effects this experiment had on the exposed individuals were nasty. In our 7th spot, we have weaponizing the plague. In the late 1980s, the Soviet Union thought it was a good idea to use the plague as a weapon. Keep in mind, when the plague was around, it killed half of Europe's population. During the 13th and 14th centuries, the amount of people in the world dropped by 100 million people because of this. But they ignored all that and decided that it was a good idea to launch the plague at enemies in missile warheads. But it wasn't just the plague. They had hundreds of tons of anthrax and smallpox as well. How great is that? All we need is for countries to start a biological warfare. The population would be wiped out so fast. Coming in at number 6, we have the infected mosquitoes. From 1956 to 1957, the United States Army conducted a number of biological warfare experiments on unsuspecting residents of Savannah, Georgia and Avon Park, Florida. One of these experiments involved releasing millions of infected mosquitoes into the cities. They wanted to see if the mosquitoes could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. The mosquitoes were infected with these. Turns out that they could, and the results were shocking. Some experienced respiratory problems, others got encephalitis and typhoid. Some even gave birth to stillborn babies. As for the public, well, a number of individuals got sick from these mosquitoes, and several people died as a result. Imagine if these tests were still up and running today and a country was able to weaponize mosquitoes and other insects. That would be very disastrous. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the human experimentation. Over the years, the Soviet Union has performed a number of unethical tests on humans, including testing a number of poisonous gases on them. So beginning in 1921, the Soviet Union created a number of poison laboratories. They called them Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, and Camera. In these laboratories, the unthinkable would happen. They wanted to find a tasteless, odorless chemical that could kill someone, but not be detected in their autopsies. So they tested a number of poisons on people, including mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, and curare. They were given these poisons in their food or drinks, or they would take it straight up thinking that it was medication. Hundreds of test subjects died as a result. And it's scary why the Soviets wanted to do these experiments in the first place. Basically, they wanted a way to kill people without people knowing it was them doing so. If a person dies from a poison and it's not detected post-mortem, then they could get away with it. So who knows how many people they killed outside of these experiments. And apparently the labs were reactivated in the late 1990s. So who knows what they're working on now. Moving on to number 4, we have North Korea. North Korea is highly secretive, so it's hard to know exactly what they're working on over there. But apparently they are running a number of experiments on their prisoners. Rumor has it that each month, a black van known as the Crow goes around collecting 40 to 50 people. These people then get taken to an unknown location for experiments. Some prisoners are tortured, others are starved, others are suffocated to death with gas. It's said that in one experiment, 50 women died within 20 minutes after eating poisoned cabbage leaves. The purpose of these experiments are unknown, but we know that North Korea has something up their sleeve. Coming in at number 3, we have Starfish Prime. Starfish Prime is the name of a series of tests that began in 1962. Basically, it involved the detonation of a nuclear weapon outside of Earth's magnetic field. That sounds like a terrible idea, am I right? But it wasn't just one nuclear weapon. They detonated 6 nuclear weapons. Luckily, our magnetic field didn't get destroyed. It just snapped back into place, as they said. But if it was permanently altered, that's bad. We would have lost protection from cosmic rays and solar winds. Not only that, but we would have experienced massive earthquakes as the continents moved around. In our second spot, we have SETI, or SETI, which stands for the Search of Extraterrestrial Intelligence. This is a program that has been trying to find alien life out in our solar system for more than 5 decades. But here's the thing. A number of people are worried about this program. They are sending out signals telling other life where we are, meaning if there is anything else out there, we are opening ourselves out for contact. And if they have sinister intentions, they could come and wipe out our entire planet. Like, we're just assuming that aliens are friendly and won't want to take control of Earth. If advanced civilizations do exist in the galaxy, who says they don't have the power to come here and kill us all? Hey, maybe they've been preparing for this for the past 5 decades, who knows? And in our number 1 spot today, we have Magnaporthgria. This is a fungus that can leave nasty lesions on plants and cause huge damage to crops. In fact, it can release thousands of spores and contaminate acres of crops in a single night. Well, during the Cold War, the US did experiments using this fungus. They tried to weaponize it in a form of a spray or a bomb. Now, this was very dangerous. Because of how fast this fungus spreads, it could cause uncontrollable damage to the world's most important crops, leading to worldwide famine.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Milgram experiment. If any of you guys have studied psychology at school, you've probably heard of this one. Stanley Milgram was a psychologist who conducted a study in America to see how far people would go when obeying an authority figure. The participants were told they were to give small electric shocks to other participants behind a wall every time they answered a question incorrectly. In reality, the electric shocks were fake and the other participants were just actors. Amazingly, even when the fake test subjects screamed out in pain, many of the participants would continue to administer what would have been fatal electric shocks just because the doctor urged them to continue. Many of the people involved in this claim they were traumatized for life, and the study has been ethically criticized in the years since. Moving on to number 9 now, we have the Challenger explosion. On January 28, 1986, the NASA Space Shuttle Challenger launched from Florida. On board were 5 astronauts and 2 payload specialists who were going to conduct research in space. 73 seconds into the flight, the ship broke apart and disintegrated over the Atlantic Ocean. There were no survivors. After an investigation, it was determined that the fault lied with the design of the shuttle's O-rings. This was a problem which NASA had actually known about for almost 10 years, but those higher up in the organization had refused to listen to the concerns of engineers who thought a disaster like this could happen. The shuttle program was stopped for almost 3 years while investigations and improvements were made. Next up at number 8 now, we have the air crash. Jean-Francois de Rosier was a French teacher of physics and chemistry during the late 18th century. He also had a passion for aviation and conducted many experiments using a hot air balloon. Eventually, he decided to push the balloon to its limit by attempting to cross the English Channel. On the 15th of June 1785, his attempt ended in disaster when the balloon was blown off course and deflated at a height of 1,500 feet. De Rosier was killed and his wife died 8 days later from suspected suicide. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Unit 731. This was a secret unit of the Japanese army during World War II that carried out horrific experiments on civilians and prisoners. It's estimated that the project involved 250,000 men, women and children. Most of them were Chinese, along with some prisoners of war from Russia and the Allies. The procedures conducted on the patients included cutting them open without anesthesia, unnecessary amputations, and removal of organs such as the brain, liver and lungs. Others were used for weapons testing and died to grenades or flamethrowers. The true extent of the suffering is still being discovered today. Next up, number 6 now, we have the X-ray. Clarence Madison Daly was Thomas Edison's assistant. Now you might know Thomas Edison as the inventor of the light bulb, but he is also known for his work on X-rays. In the early days of X-ray researching, nobody realized just how dangerous they could be without taking the proper precautions. Daly acted as Edison's test subject and ended up getting radiation damage to his hands and face that required him to take time off work. At first, one of his hands was amputated and then 4 fingers on the other. Eventually, the cancer spread and he needed both arms amputated before eventually dying. He is thought to be the first American to die from the effects of experimentation with radiation. After this, Thomas Edison abandoned his research on X-rays, stating, "Don't talk to me about X-rays, I am afraid of them." Alright, next up at number 5 now, we have the nuclear bomb. In 1934, scientist Enrico Fermi bombarded uranium with neutrons and created what he thought was a new artificial element in the periodic table. He won a Nobel Prize for his work. Over the next few years, scientists began to realize that what had actually happened was that the uranium atom had been split in 2. This had the potential to release huge amounts of energy that could be used for power or to build a devastating bomb. During World War II, the US set up the Manhattan Project to explore this option. It took just a few years for them to perfect the bomb. 2 of them were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing 150,000 people and many more from radiation. Japan surrendered soon after, bringing an end to World War II. Some scientists who worked on the first studies of nuclear fission were horrified that their discoveries had been used for such violence. Others felt it was the only way to end that war. Next up at number 4 now, we have Carl Scheele. He was a Swedish and German chemist who made a number of chemical discoveries during the late 18th century. These include the likes of molybdenum, tungsten, manganese and chloride. Unfortunately, Scheele liked to taste the new chemicals that he had discovered. Any chemist chemists will tell you this is probably not a good idea, especially when one of his discoveries was hydrogen cyanide, the key word there being cyanide. Eventually the experiments caught up to him and Skilly died aged 43 from symptoms that resembled mercury poisoning. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Alexander Bogdanov. He was a Russian doctor and philosopher known for his work on blood transfusion. He used himself as the test subject and conducted 11 transfusions which he claimed had stopped his balding and improved his eyesight. Bogdanov was a pioneer in blood transfusion, and that's the key thing to remember here, a pioneer. Nobody fully understood the dangers of it, including him. In 1928 he took a blood transfusion from a person infected with malaria and tuberculosis. As you might expect, he died shortly after. Next number 2 now, we have Joseph Mengele. To call these science experiments may not even be fair, some might just call them torture. Mengele was a Nazi doctor who carried out medical experiments on thousands of prisoners in concentration camps during the Holocaust. He would purposefully induce hypothermia, infect them with malaria, or force them to inhale mustard gas, all to just see the effects. He would also forcibly sterilize people and infect wounds with bacteria, as well as filling them with wood shavings and ground glass. He's perhaps most famous though for his obsession with twins. He was known to have once sewed 2 twins together in a twisted effort to create conjoined twins. And finally, number 1 now, we have Marie Curie. She is one of the most famous scientists of all time, and for good reason. Born in Poland, she went on to become the only scientist to ever win the Nobel Prize in 2 separate fields of study, chemistry and physics. She studied a number of radioactive isotopes and discovered the elements of polonium and radium. She also developed mobile radiography units to provide X-rays to field hospitals. Her work was groundbreaking, but as you might expect, radiation was not fully understood at the turn of the 20th century. Her constant exposure to this radiation led to her getting leukemia. She eventually died from aplastic anemia.